All right, this is the self-directed help seeking and skill growth project in design technology and research in the Agile Research Studio Special Interest Group. My name is Shankar Salwan, and I will be presenting you my work done so far in my research and project. So, kind of an introduction is to first defining what self directed help seeking is. Self directed help seeking is how users in self directed learning or self regulated learning communities or any type of kind of learning community are able to direct their help seeking needs as to how they identify their obstacles, how they identify what the help seeking needs are, how they identify resources they should seek help from, and how they're able to get help and kind of evaluate the help's effectiveness to see how they're able to overcome their problems yet or not. And that's self-directed help seeking, where it's kind of the user realizing themselves that help is required and how they're going about that process. Um, the audience that this problem kind of adheres to is usually people in communities that practice self-regulated or self-directed learning, and the practical audience that I'm concerned with are students in the DDR community. And the current tool we use to facilitate this is called the Weekly, and I'll be showing you this in later slides. So the design problem we face here is kind of why is it difficult for kind of help seeking to take place in self-directed learning communities? How hard is it for people to actually say that, oh, I'm stuck on a problem, like, I should seek help? And the difficulty we realize here is in a learning community like a DTR, where there are a lot of novice researchers and novice members, it's very hard to keep track of your own learning and at the same time seeking help effectively. And this is difficult is as since users are kind of in charge of their own learning, while meant to scaffold it is um, it's hard to identify like the help seeking needs and the exact requirements that they have that they need to seek help from, and that reflection is very important in these communities. So while there are current help recommendation solutions such as the expertise recommending and the answer garden, what they kind of fail to do is promote this reflection of identifying the problem and resources to seek help from, even if it is through scaffolds or whatever it may be, but they don't have that reflection in the first place. And actually being able to scaffold or facilitate that final help seeking and being able to see that people are actually able to get the help they need. So the points of failure that we see in current design solutions and research here is a lack of a self-directed learning model in to be facilitated for help-seeking requirements such as these. So the conceptual approach that I see towards self-directed help-seeking is breaking it down into three phases. Is one is being able to identify the help-seeking needs. Second, being able to identify available resources within your community or available resources that you can actually leverage to overcome this help-seeking need or problem you identified. And lastly, being able to get the help required or identified to overcome the obstacle. And the tool currently being used, as I mentioned before, is the Weekly. And in the next slide, I'll be showing you how it is. So this is a Weekly filled out by a peer of mine in DDR. And kind of how it's broken down is you have the three phases, such as one is identifying the obstacle you face, second is identifying a learning module or learning resource, and the focus of it, which is again identifying resources. Second is identifying three people that could help and three outlets. So this is kind of like a method of what good resources look like, and coupling of the outlets with the learning module and kind of the people is how to execute good help seeking strategies. And this is like a brief example of what it looks filled out. Um, so over the quarter, I kind of worked on formulating what my research questions are and what I want to study. And I formulated these two questions. The first being, how can we measure and identify effective help-seeking strategies in self-regulated learning community, self-regulated, self-directed, kind of the same thing. And the second question being, how might we scaffold students to reflect so that they are able to identify actionable obstacles and required resources to facilitate their help-seeking. So the problem I'd spoken about earlier is the reflection that's kind of lacking in current solutions. So my research here is like, how can we actually scaffold that reflection and make sure it takes place and it happens? And before I actually do this, I want to study how what good help-seeking strategies look like in self-directed learning community. How are they kind of thought about, or what are like conceptual approach to it, and how is it currently being practiced and how to measure it. So my contributions so far this quarter were I worked on need finding through interviews, and I had conducted a questionnaire as well as a survey during my status update, through which I wanted to identify what current help seeking strategies are and how the current tool is actually serving the community and how is it being used. And in my need finding, through my interviews, I'd actually observed people and just kind of shadowed them while they were filling out the weekly. So the weekly is supposed to be filled out before members come into their studio class on Fridays. And some members usually fill it out about an hour and a half before, in that time, taking about 15 to 20 minutes to fill it out. And I'd requested certain users if I could actually shadow them while doing this and ask them questions. Second, at the questionnaire and survey I'd spoken about that I conducted my status update, and a studio discussion towards the end of my status update to actually bounce ideas off of how students feel the weekly is serving them, how they're using it, etc., etc. So, kind of a user journey map that I'd worked on, as it can be seen here. Um, and kind of through this user journey map, I was able to identify certain user pain points that exist and deviations from expected behavior we have in self-directed help seeking. So large user pain points are that, firstly, in identifying resources, users feel like they're not aware of other skill sets that are available and experiences other people have that they could kind of leverage to seek help from. Learning modules can be dense, and the blocker might be very specific in a certain way, or like kind of just a thin slice of what a learning module looks like, and it's hard to identify what that exact slice is sometimes. A lot of the time, users restrict themselves and feel bounded to certain resources and outlets. As for outlets, they feel like there's only a certain effectiveness of them, and for resources, they're not aware of other things they can use and feel like only people in their special interest group or people who are aware of their project very well could actually help them. And a lot of the time, users wait for coincidence help seeking, so it's kind of like they hope that the resources they want to utilize are in the same space as them at the same time so they can seek help, not more of actively seeking help. That also comes in the deviation of expected behavior. The last point of waiting for help seeking opportunities to arise is students wait for studios or less sick time. Um, Also, people are unable to identify actionable and concrete blockers. They're able to kind of vaguely word, and this is taken from studies conducted on the weekly, vaguely word their help requests and not specifically say what they are. And there's no distribution of resource identification. It's very strained towards certain resources only by certain people, so which is a deviation from my expected behavior. So my design arguments so far have been that one, user should be able to identify current obstacles that they're facing and be able to identify the core competencies of them. So identify the concrete and actionable aspects of them. So an example would be if a user has an obstacle of prototyping, they should be able to say what specifically in prototyping they're struggling with. So it could be that I'm struggling to facilitate a help seeking bot using Slack, and I'm not sure how to kind of script questions for it. That's a actionable and concrete blocker, so it'll be easier for them to seek help with. Second is users should be able to leverage all available resources in the community to seek help from. So they should be able to identify and select these resources that are available to them in the community. And lastly, users should be able to leverage these resources for their identified problems in the end and seek help for it and kind of overcome their obstacle or blocker to make progress in their project or towards their learning needs. So the study was a kind of a merge with my need finding, also with the question I had conducted, which was to gauge how users identified a listed help request that was recorded in the weekly. So this was conducted in week 7, and I'd taken responses from week 6 of users weekly and see how they identified this help request and how did they actually seek help from it to overcome this and kind of go ahead with it. And in identifying etc., what were the kind of tiny bits that worked on. And in the survey, I just wanted to gauge how users actually use the weekly and the scaffold in it. and how they work about how it's facilitating anything in their project and what they actually use it for. So through the study I had conducted, there were a lot of interesting findings I had. So the first finding that I'd like to mention is most help seeking for the listed help requests in week 6 of their weekly was done through either leveraging their SIG members or their partners in their projects, or brought about in SIG meetings and seek help there. And a lot of it was used through time in studio, which is kind of correlates to another finding I have, which I'll be talking about in the next slide. So, as noted, kind of significant statistics here is 8 out of 9 users either listed their SIG members or said that they use SIG meetings to resolve their problems. About 6 out of 9 participants also stated that they were using studio time in LIP, which is learning in progress, to work on the learning model that identified to overcome their blocker. And lastly, 3 out of 9 users said that they utilize pair research time to work on their blocker, so which was an interesting finding. So, second interesting finding that I'd like to touch upon here is to identify the help-seeking needs. Users were able to identify resources to reflect from. So these resources could be their canvas, their design log, their sprint log, but basically users were actually thinking about what their blockers are and not kind of aimlessly listing it. And we noted that 7 out of 9 users either use a design log, sprint log, or canvas. And based on my findings in the fall, I'd actually stated that users should be able to use a sprint log to reflect on their blockers. This was an interesting finding, as out of these 7 out of 9 users, only 3 use the sprint log. My third finding is the weekly is majorly used for help seeking during studio time, which correlates to my first finding. Is what's interesting about it is the weekly is actually being used by students to identify how they can use time in studio, or what learning module they can use, or what they can kind of do during pair research to work upon their project, to maybe seek help or kind of make progress in their learning, which is kind of interesting because the weekly initially was as a tool made to facilitate help seeking and learning needs throughout a week, and not just for a specific time frame during the week. And the last interesting finding was many users are not aware of skill sets and experiences beyond just their SIG members and who they know. So it makes it really difficult for them to identify resources and outlets in the weekly, and they kind of list a similar thing across weeks. So through all of this, kind of like the next steps I've identified in my project is I have a lot of responses for help requests and strategies that I thought about for the weekly over the course of the quarter, and it would be great to kind of qualitatively code it up to see what type of help requests exist and how for each type of help request, how users are actually identifying other people to seek help from, while taking into mind the finding that I had that weekly is used majorly for studio time and how to strategize that. Secondly, it's I've realized that there are a lot of important measures that I haven't been able to explicitly define that are very important for understanding self-directed learning. Is firstly, like, what do you define as a blocker? What is a good resource to seek help from for a particular type of blocker? Or what actually is a good blocker and how should it be worded? And what does a good help-seeking plan look like? So all these things are all these questions are kind of questions I want to study, but I need to have a certain frame of answering for them. So while I'm conducting my studies, I'm actually able to correlate them back to claims. Thirdly, understanding how help seeking is practiced outside the frame of the weekly. Uh, from my finding in the study, I saw that people majorly use the weekly to identify help seeking needs that can be done during studio time, and there's no way to actually measure how help seeking is being done outside of studio and what strategies students are implementing then when they face an obstacle. And last next step for me would be to actually being able to brainstorm methods that overcome some of these identified gaps that I've had, such as users not being able to identify other resources because of lack of awareness, how we can scaffold thinking of how to get to concrete competencies of a blocker. So yeah, that is kind of my findings and next steps I have for this quarter. And thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.